Welcome back to the deep dive, everyone. Today, we're diving into a case, a story, I guess you could say, that has earned itself a very striking nickname: Britain's Roswell.
Ooh.
We're talking about the Rendlesham Forest Incident,
Yeah?
December 1980 in Suffolk, England. And you may have heard bits and pieces of the story before, maybe seen a grainy photo here or there. But what we're going to do today is give you a clear, insightful, complete picture of what happened
Right.
and the many, many different ways that these events have been interpreted.
That's right. And to do this deep dive, we've compiled all the essential information about Rendlesham.
Yep.
So our mission today is to cut through the noise, go beyond those catchy headlines, and really examine what happened at Rendlesham Forest. We'll look at all the different explanations that have been offered
Right.
and try to understand why this case, why this series of events still fascinates us, all these decades later.
Yeah.
And we'll do all this without overwhelming you with too many tiny little details. We just want to give you the good stuff.
Right to the point. All right, so the story begins, right? In the early hours of December 26, 1980, around 3:00 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time,
Okay.
security patrol near the east gate of RAF Woodbridge, that's Royal Air Force Base Woodbridge, by the way,
Right.
being used by the U.S. Air Force at the time, they reported seeing lights descending into Rendlesham Forest, which is nearby. And so, naturally, their first thought was, oh, this must be a downed aircraft.
Makes sense.
Right, something like that.
Totally. Well, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, who was the deputy base commander at the time, he documented these initial sightings in memo to the UK Ministry of Defense.
Oh, okay.
But here's the interesting thing. He records the date as December 27th,
Huh.
not the 26th. So in this memo, he describes a glowing metallic object with colored lights.
Okay.
And the security patrol, they also said that this object seemed to move through the trees,
Wow.
like through the dense forest. They also reported that the farm animals nearby were going crazy. Yeah, much more active than usual. And that little detail, that always adds to the mystery, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Now, there's another piece of this puzzle, a really intriguing one, actually, but it wasn't publicly known at the time.
Mm-hmm.
One of the security personnel involved, Sergeant Jim Peniston, later on, he claimed that he actually encountered a craft of unknown origin in the forest.
Oh, wow.
But it's super important to remember that this account wasn't made public right away.
Right.
And it doesn't have any, direct confirmation from other witnesses who were there that night.
That's important.
Yeah.
When we look at the timing of these light sightings, it's interesting because it actually coincides with, believe it or not, a pretty normal astronomical event.
Okay.
Scientists have suggested that the lights people saw descending into the forest, it could have just been a bright fireball,
Okay.
a meteor burning up over southern England.
Makes sense.
And it was observed around the same time. So right off the bat, we have a pretty plausible natural explanation to consider.
Right.
And this really highlights a pattern we see often with UFO sightings.
Yeah.
Something that might be totally normal gets interpreted as something extraordinary.
Yeah.
It shows you the power of context, right?
Yeah.
And expectation and how they shape what we see and experience.
That's so true. So, okay, let's move on to the morning of December 26th.
Right.
So after this first night of weird lights and everything, the servicemen, they went back to a small clearing on the eastern edge of the forest, and they found 3 small triangular depressions in the ground.
Oh, wow.
Some people also said there were burn marks in the plants and broken branches on the trees.
Interesting.
So this discovery, this is one of the main things that really fueled the speculation about what happened.
Yeah.
They even called the local police to come look at these impressions in the ground.
Okay.
And the police, their initial thought was pretty simple. They thought maybe it was just an animal that made those marks. So pretty grounded. And for anyone who likes to see things, there's actually a photograph of this supposed landing site that was published in Georgina Bruni's book about the incident.
Oh, cool.
All right, let's fast forward a couple days to December 28th.
Okay.
Now, at this point, everyone's getting a little concerned, so Lieutenant Colonel Halt, the deputy base commander, he decides to go to the site himself with some other servicemen.
Okay.
And they go in the early hours of the morning.
Right.
Again, there's a little discrepancy in the timeline.
Uh-huh.
Halt actually recorded this visit as happening on December 29th.
Interesting.
But anyway, during this investigation, they brought equipment to take some measurements.
They did? What kind?
Yeah, they used a device called an ANPDR-27, which measures ionizing radiation.
Oh, okay.
And you know what? Inside those triangular depressions, they measured 0.07 milliroentgens per hour.
Okay.
But in the areas around the marks, the radiation was way lower, like normal background levels, around 0.03 to 0.04 millieregons per hour. What's even more interesting is they found another little burst of radiation about half a mile away from that first spot.
Really?
Yeah, and here's the kicker. Halt was recording all of this in real time.
Oh, wow.
On a little micro cassette recorder.
He was?
Yeah, and this recording has become known as the, you guessed it, Halt tape.
The Halt tape.
The Halt tape, exactly.
Wow, so the sightings didn't stop after the first night.
Nope.
They kept going.
They did. So during Halt's investigation on the 28th, they saw a flashing red light to the east.
Okay.
And this was roughly in the same direction as a farmhouse that the initial witnesses had seen. But if you look at a map of the area, further to the east, in that same line of sight, is the Orford Ness Lighthouse.
Oh, okay. So geographically it lines up.
Exactly. So now, according to Halt's memo, they also saw 3 star-like lights in the sky.
Right.
2 of them were to the north, and 1 was to the south, about 10 degrees above the horizon. Halt specifically mentioned that the brightest of these lights, it hovered for like 2 or 3 hours.
Wow.
And it seemed to beam down a light every now and then.
Huh. That's interesting.
Of course, the skeptics, they have an explanation for this too. They think it was just bright stars.
Right. Of course.
Yeah. Let's take a moment to get our bearings here.
Sure.
Rendlesham Forest, it's a pretty big area.
Okay.
About 5.8 square miles, mostly pine trees, located in Suffolk. It's close to 2 former military bases.
All right.
RAF Bentwaters just to the north, and RAF Woodbridge, which actually kind of extends into the forest itself.
Okay.
At the time, both of these bases were being used by the USAF.
The U.S. Air Force. Got it.
Right. And the main area where all this stuff happened was near the eastern end of the RAF Woodbridge runway,
Okay.
about 0.3 miles east of the East Gate.
Right.
And it goes about a mile towards a farmer's field in Capel Green.
Gotcha. And that Orford Ness Lighthouse, where is that in relation to all of this?
Good question. It's about 5 miles east of the edge of the forest.
Okay.
So right in that same line of sight where they saw the flashing red light.
Right.
And at the time, it was one of the strongest lighthouses in the whole UK.
Wow.
It flashed once every 5 seconds. Remember that?
Once every 5 seconds. Okay. I got it.
It'll be important later. So now let's look at the main evidence in this case.
Right.
First, we have the Halt memo.
Okay.
This was written by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt to the UK Ministry of Defense. But it wasn't released publicly until 1983.
Oh, wow.
Through the U.S. Freedom of Information Act. The memo itself is dated January 13th, 1981, and it's called Unexplained Lights.
Okay.
And it's important to note that there's a 2-week delay between the actual events and this written record,
Right.
which could maybe explain why some of the dates and times don't quite match up.
That makes sense. You know, David Clark, who has worked with the National Archives on UFO files,
Yeah.
he looked into this memo.
Okay.
And he talked to people who were involved.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems that the Ministry of Defense's investigation into Rendlesham was pretty quick.
Really?
Yeah, some people even described it as cursory.
Yeah.
And apart from Halt's memo, there aren't really any other formal reports on the incident from either the USAF or the UK government at the time.
Wow.
And as you mentioned earlier, Halt himself later said he believed he saw something extraterrestrial.
Right.
And that there was a cover-up.
Right. Okay, next we have the Halt tape, which was released in 1984.
All right, the famous Halt tape.
Yeah, it's a real-time recording that Halt made during his investigation on that second night.
Okay.
On the tape, you can hear them taking radiation readings,
Uh-huh.
talking about the flashing light they saw through the trees,
Right.
and their observations of those star-like objects that seem to be just, like, hanging there and twinkling.
Wow.
Researcher Ian Ridpath actually made a really detailed transcript and analysis of the whole tape.
He did?
Yeah, and you can find it online if you're interested. And then in 1997, researcher James Easton, he managed to get the original witness statements from the security personnel who were there on that first night.
Oh, wow.
And these statements, they give us some really fascinating firsthand accounts.
I bet.
For example, Ed Kebbensag, he said, and I quote, "We figured the lights were coming from past the forest since nothing was visible when we passed through the woody forest."
Interesting.
He also talked about seeing a glow near what they thought was a beacon light at first, but as they got closer, they realized it was just a farmhouse with the lights on.
Oh, okay.
And eventually, when they had a clearer view, they figured out that what they were actually following was indeed a beacon light way off in the distance.
So it was just a matter of perspective.
Exactly. It really shows how your perception can change as you get more information.
Yeah, that's true.
John Burroughs, another guy from the first night, he backed this up. He said they followed a beacon for about 2 miles before they realized it was coming from a lighthouse.
So the Orford Ness Lighthouse.
Most likely, yeah. And it makes you think,
It does.
We can misinterpret even familiar things when we're in like unusual situations.
Right.
Burroughs also said he heard this sound like a woman was screaming, and he said the farm animals were making a lot of noise too.
Huh.
Holt also mentioned hearing strange noises 2 nights later during his investigation.
Really?
Yeah, but there's a pretty good natural explanation for this too.
What is it?
Muntjac deer.
Muntjac deer.
Yeah, they're pretty common in Rendlesham Forest, and when they're startled or scared, they make this really loud, shrill bark that can sound a lot like a scream.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, it's pretty creepy. Now, jumping ahead again, in June 2010, Colonel Charles Holt, who was retired by then, he signed a sworn statement.
Okay.
And in the statement, he basically repeated what he'd said before.
Okay.
But he explicitly said that he believed he saw an extraterrestrial event and that both the UK and the US governments had covered it up.
Wow, he went all in.
He did. But the skeptics, they've pointed out some contradictions between this later statement and what Holt wrote in his original memo and said on the audio tape.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And these discrepancies, they're a big part of the ongoing debate about Rendlesham. It shows how tricky memory can be, especially after so many years.
That's true. Memories can be unreliable.
For sure. And to add another layer to this, in 2010, the base commander at the time of the incident, Colonel Ted Conrad, he gave his own statement about the events.
Oh, wow.
And he was very clear. He said, "We saw nothing that resembled Lieutenant Colonel Halt's descriptions either in the sky or on the ground."
Huh.
He also mentioned that they had people ready to check out Halt's story, but none of them could confirm it.
Wow.
And in a later interview, Conrad was pretty critical of Halt's claims.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he even suggested that the whole thing might have been a hoax.
Wow.
He also directly disputed Sergeant Jim Peniston's claim about touching an alien spacecraft.
He did.
Yeah, he said Peniston never mentioned anything like that during their debriefing.
Huh. So what about the local police? Did they get involved in all of this?
Yeah, they did. 2 officers from the Suffolk Constabulary, they were called to the scene on the night of the first sightings,
Okay.
and then again the next morning.
Got it.
And what did they find?
Yeah, what did they say?
Well, according to their log, which was released in 2005, nothing unusual.
Really?
Yeah, on that first night, they specifically wrote down that the only lights they could see were from the Orford Lighthouse.
Okay.
And they figured the dents in the ground were made by animals.
Makes sense.
Yeah, the file also has a note from Inspector Mike Topless.
All right.
He mentioned that one of the officers who went to the scene that first night went back during the day
Okay.
and still couldn't find anything unusual.
Oh,
He
wow.
wasn't convinced at all.
Yeah.
Topless also talked about the really strong beams of light from the landing beacon at RAF Bentwaters and the Orford Ness Lighthouse.
Right.
And he said he'd seen how those beams could create weird visual effects at night,
Oh,
especially in certain weather conditions.
that makes sense. So where does the UK Ministry of Defense stand on all this? What's their official position?
Well, they've always said that Rendlesham Forest wasn't a threat to national security.
Okay.
And because of that, they never really investigated it as a security matter.
Wow.
When they finally released their files on it in 2001, it was mostly just internal emails and replies to questions from the public,
Oh, well.
which shows you they didn't think it was that big of a deal.
Yeah.
And in those files, there's a statement from Lord Trifgarn, who was the defense minister at the time.
Right.
He explains why the model didn't investigate Rendlesham more thoroughly.
Interesting.
It basically confirms that the government was trying to downplay the whole thing.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the skeptical viewpoints on Rendlesham.
Yeah.
What do they say?
The most common explanation among skeptics is that it was just a bunch of normal things happening,
Right.
but people misinterpreted them.
Okay, makes sense. Like what kinds of things?
So those first lights that people reported seeing going down into the forest on December 26th, they probably coincided with a bright fireball,
Oh, okay.
a meteor,
Right.
that was seen flying over southern England around the same time.
Okay.
And these kinds of events in the atmosphere, they happen all the time.
Yeah.
And they often lead to UFO reports.
True.
And those triangular marks in the clearing,
Yeah.
both the police and the forestry workers who saw them, they figured they were just rabbit holes.
Oh, okay.
And most importantly, there's never been any actual physical evidence to suggest that anything landed in the forest.
Right.
Nothing concrete.
So what about the flashing red light?
Well, the statements from the first night, They all put that light in the same direction as the Orfordness Lighthouse.
Right.
And remember, those security guys who went to check it out, they eventually realized it was much farther away than they thought and that it was probably a beacon or a lighthouse.
Yeah.
So it seems like they just misjudged the distance and what the light actually was.
It happens.
And get this, Halt's audio recording from December 28th. It shows that the flashing light he saw, which was in the same direction as the one from before, it flashed once every 5 seconds.
Wait a minute.
Exactly.
That's the same as the Orfordness Lighthouse.
Exactly. That timing is a big clue for the skeptics.
Makes sense. What about those star-like objects Halt saw? What do they say about those?
Skeptics say those were probably just bright stars.
Huh?
Maybe their appearance got distorted by the atmosphere or some kind of optical illusion.
Right.
And bright stars, they cause a lot of UFO reports.
Yeah, for sure.
And the brightest light they saw to the south, it was in the same spot as Sirius.
Sirius, the brightest star in the sky.
Exactly.
Wow, it all kind of fits, huh?
It does. Now, author Brian Dunning, he did a whole analysis of the eyewitness reports, the recordings, the media coverage, the whole 9 yards.
Oh, wow.
And his conclusion is that while Colonel Halt's documentation is impressive, everything he reported, both on the tape and in his memo, can be explained in totally normal, everyday terms. He says it's all about misidentification or natural phenomena.
Interesting.
He also addresses those claims of secret debriefings and threats, pointing out that everyone involved, including Halt, they've talked about it openly over the years,
Right.
which makes the idea of a big cover-up seem less likely.
Yeah, I guess so.
And Dunning says it's important to look at each piece of evidence separately, rather than trying to force them all into one big, extraordinary story.
Makes sense. You know, Jenny Randles, she was one of the first people to investigate Rendlesham back in 1981.
Oh, wow.
And she co-wrote the first book about it.
Really?
But she's actually changed her mind about it over the years.
She has.
Yeah. She says that some parts of the incident are still kind of strange.
Okay.
But she doesn't think aliens were involved anymore.
Huh.
She thinks it was probably just people misperceiving normal things under unusual, maybe stressful conditions.
Right.
Which is interesting because it shows how our understanding of things can evolve as we get more information and new perspectives.
For sure. We should also mention a few other explanations that have been thrown around for Rendlesham, but they don't really hold up.
Yeah.
One theory was that a former U.S. security policeman named Kevin Condy created strange lights in the forest as a joke.
Oh, okay.
But there's no proof that this happened on those specific nights in December 1980.
Right.
Then there's the idea of a crashed Soviet spy satellite.
Oh,
Again, no evidence for that.
gotcha.
And then there's this really out there theory about an assassin revenge plot against the USAF.
Wow.
But that's been debunked by researchers like David Clark.
So despite all the rational explanations, this whole Rendlesham thing, it really captured people's imaginations.
Yeah, for sure.
It did. In 2005, the Forestry Commission, they actually created a UFO trail in Rendlesham Forest because so many people were interested in the story.
Wow, really?
And then in 2014, they put up a sculpture at the end of this trail.
Okay.
The artist said it was based on different sketches people made of the UFO they supposedly saw at Rendlesham.
That's pretty cool.
It just goes to show you how powerful this story is.
Yeah, it's become a part of our culture.
It has.
It's even popped up in popular media. For instance, it was a big part of a BBC Radio 4 adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft's The Whisperer in Darkness.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
So, no matter what the real explanation is, its place in our culture is undeniable.
Absolutely. So to sum up our deep dive for you today, we talked about those first sightings from the security patrol.
Yet,
Then Lieutenant Colonel Halt's investigation and all the key evidence, like his memo, the audio tape, and the witness statements.
Yep.
We also looked at the main skeptical explanations, the fireball, the lighthouse, the stars, the animal markings, all that stuff.
right.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. And despite all the skeptical arguments, Rendlesham Forest is still a fascinating case.
Yeah.
It reminds us how context and expectation can influence what we see.
Right.
How memory can be unreliable, and how unexplained events can capture our imagination and keep us talking for years.
That's so true. So here's a final thought for you, our listener.
Yeah.
After hearing all this, after going through the reports, the investigations, the scientific analyses, what part of Rendlesham Forest do you find the most interesting?
Yeah.
Or maybe the most confusing?
Good question.
We encourage you to do your own digging. Read the documents, listen to the recordings, explore the different analyses out there,
Yeah.
and come to your own conclusions about Britain's own Roswell.
That's it for today's deep dive. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time.
See